My mother-in-law pointed across the courtroom and laughed. She doesn't even have a lawyer. A few people sitting behind her smiled. One of them actually shook his head as if he'd already seen how this would end. Then the judge walked through the side door, glanced toward me, and said in a calm voice that stopped every whisper in the room, "Good morning, Colonel." Silence. I watched Patricia Bennett's smile disappear so quickly it almost made me feel sorry for her. Almost. My name is Laura Bennett. I'm 42 years old, and until 3 years ago, I wore the eagle insignia of a United States Army colonel. Most people who knew me now had no idea. That was exactly how I wanted it. I lived in a modest brick ranch house on the west side of Richmond, Virginia, about 15 minutes from downtown, if Interstate 64 wasn't backed up. Every weekday started almost the same. Coffee before sunrise. Feed our golden retriever Max. Wake my 11-year-old daughter Emma for school. Drive past Carytown while she finished her breakfast sandwich in the passenger seat. Normal routines were comforting after everything we'd been through. My husband Daniel had loved routines too. He used to joke that military families survived because someone always knew what came next. Then one Tuesday morning, nothing came next. Daniel died during a National Guard helicopter training exercise outside Fort Pickett. The Army investigation ruled it an accident. That didn't make it easier to explain to an 8-year-old girl why her father wasn't coming home. It also didn't make things easier with Daniel's parents. At first, Patricia and Richard Bennett seemed supportive. They brought casseroles. They hugged Emma. They cried with us at Arlington National Cemetery while soldiers folded the American flag. For a few months, I honestly believed grief had pulled us closer together. I couldn't have been more wrong. About 6 months after Daniel's funeral, Patricia began making little comments. They never should have let Daniel fly those dangerous missions. You always encouraged him to stay in. If he'd taken that engineering job in Charlotte, he'd still be alive. She never said the words directly. She didn't have to. Every sentence carried the same accusation. You took my son away. I ignored it. Not because I agreed. Because I knew grief can twist good people into saying cruel things. Or at least I wanted to believe that. Over time, the comments became sharper. When Emma wanted to spend weekends with her grandparents, Patricia questioned everything I did. Why wasn't Emma in private school? Why didn't I buy a larger house? Why was I driving a 5-year-old Honda Pilot instead of something newer? She loved comparing me to Daniel's older brother Stephen and his wife Melissa. They've done very well. Translation? You haven't. The funny thing was, I could have afforded a much bigger house. I could have driven anything I wanted. I simply didn't care. After leaving the Army, I'd accepted a quiet consulting position with a veterans legal nonprofit. The pay wasn't spectacular, but it covered the bills. Between my pension, Daniel's survivor benefits, and years of careful saving, Emma and I were comfortable. Comfortable didn't impress Patricia. Appearances did. One Sunday after church, she looked around my kitchen while I made grilled cheese sandwiches for Emma. You know, she said, Daniel always deserved more. I buttered another slice of bread. He deserved a long life, she sighed dramatically. I meant financially. I looked at her. I know what you meant. She smiled politely. The conversation ended there, but I noticed Emma listening from the dining room. That bothered me more than Patricia ever could. Over the next 2 years, things steadily got worse. Patricia started telling relatives that I was emotionally unstable. She claimed military service had changed me. She told neighbors I barely left the house. At Thanksgiving, she announced to the entire table that I had been some kind of military office worker. A clerk, wasn't it? I simply passed the mashed potatoes. Daniel squeezed my hand under the table. Then I remembered. Daniel wasn't there anymore. Old habits can linger long after the people connected to them are gone. I quietly withdrew my hand and picked up my glass of iced tea. No, I answered. I wasn't a clerk. She laughed. Oh, right, administrative management. I smiled. If that's what you'd like to believe. She rolled her eyes. You always were mysterious. No, just private. There was a difference. Very few people outside the military knew exactly what I'd spent 20 years doing. Even Daniel never pushed for details. He understood classified work. He'd simply ask, "Hard day." Sometimes I'd nod. Sometimes he'd wrap his arms around me without another question. Those moments were enough. After he died, I packed every military plaque, commendation, and photograph into storage bins. Not because I was ashamed, because I wanted Emma growing up with a mother instead of a retired officer. Those weren't the same job. Then 6 weeks before this court hearing, everything changed. A certified envelope arrived by FedEx. Inside was a petition filed in Richmond Circuit Court. Daniel's parents wanted custody of Emma. They claimed I was emotionally unfit. They alleged I isolated Emma from extended family. They questioned my financial judgment. Then came the part that truly stunned me. They also challenged my management of Daniel's survivor benefits and requested the court appoint a financial conservator. I read the paperwork twice, then a third time. Finally, I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so unbelievably disconnected from reality. Emma was thriving. Honor roll, soccer team, church youth choir, weekly counseling by choice. Our pediatrician described her as resilient. Still, court is court. Facts don't always speak for themselves. I knew Patricia had hired one of Richmond's most expensive family law firms. People told me the lead attorney won almost everything he touched. Friends encouraged me to hire someone equally aggressive. I thanked them. Then I politely declined. There was a reason. This morning I drove myself downtown before sunrise. Parked in the same public garage on East Broad Street. Stopped at a small coffee shop I'd visited for years. Black coffee. No sugar. Old habit. Then I walked 3 blocks to the courthouse, carrying nothing except a worn brown leather folder I'd owned since my Army days. Inside were neatly organized exhibits, notes, court rules. Nothing fancy, just preparation. When I entered the courtroom, Patricia spotted me immediately. She looked around, then behind me, waiting. No attorney appeared. Her smile slowly spread. She leaned toward Stephen just loudly enough for half the room to hear. She actually came alone. Then she looked directly at me. You couldn't even afford an attorney. Several people turned to watch. I met her eyes. I'm exactly where I need to be, she laughed. So you're representing yourself? I am. Her expensive lawyer adjusted his tie and smiled with the confidence of someone expecting an easy morning. The courtroom doors opened. All rise. I stood quietly as the judge entered. He arranged a few files, looked toward counsel's table. Then his eyes found mine. His expression changed ever so slightly. Recognition. He smiled. Good morning, Colonel Bennett. Every sound in the room disappeared. Patricia blinked. Wait. She stared at me. What? Nobody spoke for several seconds. You could almost hear people trying to make sense of what they'd just heard. Patricia looked from me to the judge and back again, waiting for someone to laugh and explain it was some kind of misunderstanding. Nobody did. Judge Harold Whitmore adjusted his reading glasses and glanced down at the docket. Counsel are both parties ready to proceed. Patricia's attorney cleared his throat. Yes, Your Honor. The judge looked toward me. Colonel Bennett, I am Your Honor. Patricia's eyebrows shot up. She leaned toward her attorney and whispered something so urgently that he frowned, shook his head slightly and motioned for her to stay quiet. I kept my eyes on the bench. I'd spent enough years in courtrooms to know one simple truth. Emotion was expensive. Discipline was free. The hearing began with routine matters, introductions, procedural questions, and confirmation that I had knowingly waived my right to outside counsel. The judge asked me directly, Mrs. Bennett, you understand you're representing yourself? I do. And you've reviewed the local rules of procedure? Several times. He nodded once. I expected as much. That tiny comment wasn't intended to help me. It simply reflected history. Unfortunately for Patricia, she had no idea what that history actually was. During a short recess, I stepped into the hallway outside courtroom 3B. The old marble floors reminded me of federal courthouses all over the country. Washington, Fort Bragg, Fort Hood, Fort Belvoir, places I'd hoped never to revisit after retirement. A young deputy clerk approached carrying several files. She smiled politely. It's nice to see you again, Colonel. I smiled back. It's been a while. It has. She laughed softly. My father still talks about one of your trials. I felt my stomach tighten. I hope only the legal parts. She smiled. He says you taught him what integrity looked like. I thanked her quietly. She walked away. Behind me, I heard heels clicking across the hallway. Patricia. She stopped several feet away. What is going on? I turned. What do you mean? The judge. The clerk. They keep calling you Colonel. I was one. She stared. No. Yes. You never told us. You never asked. Her face tightened. I knew you worked for the Army. I did. I know what you thought. She folded her arms. So what exactly did you do? I hesitated. That question always carried weight. The truthful answer never fit into casual conversation. I practiced law. She frowned. You were a military lawyer. Yes. That's it. Mostly. She looked almost disappointed. As a prosecutor. That made her pause. Prosecuting what? I looked through the courthouse window toward Broad Street. Cars moved normally. People hurried to lunch. Life outside continued without caring what happened inside these walls. I prosecuted serious crimes. What kind? I met her eyes. The kind people don't usually ask about twice. Before she could speak again, the bailiff called everyone back into the courtroom. That conversation ended there. at least for the moment. As I sat waiting for proceedings to resume, memories I'd spent years locking away quietly returned. I was 24 when I entered the Army Judge Advocate General's Corps. It was only a few years after September 11th. Like so many Americans, I wanted my career to matter. Law school had given me a profession. The Army gave it purpose. I started handling straightforward military justice cases, unauthorized absences, theft, fraud, drug offenses. Nothing extraordinary. But over the years, assignments changed. The military noticed who stayed calm under pressure, who prepared thoroughly, who could question witnesses without turning every hearing into a performance. Eventually, I received orders that changed my career forever. The Office of Special Investigations, later Joint Task Forces, international cases, war crimes, detainee abuse, civilian contractor corruption, cases involving officers whose names regularly appeared in newspapers. Most Americans never heard about 90% of those investigations. That was intentional. Justice often happened quietly. Some trials lasted months. Others stretched over years. I interviewed survivors through translators, studied satellite photographs, read thousands of pages of reports, sat across from people who had ordered terrible things while insisting they'd done nothing wrong. Those experiences changed me. Not in dramatic Hollywood ways. They simply made ordinary life feel precious. Grocery shopping, school concerts, cutting the grass on Saturday morning. Those things became gifts. Daniel understood that better than anyone. We met at Fort Lee during a legal briefing. He was a helicopter pilot with the Virginia National Guard. He asked me out for coffee. I said no, twice. The third time he smiled and said, "I'll keep asking until the answer changes." I laughed. It did. We married 18 months later. He never pushed me to discuss work. Sometimes I'd come home exhausted after reviewing evidence all day. He'd hand me a glass of iced tea and ask, "Want silence or conversation?" Usually, silence. He respected that. When Emma was born, everything shifted. The Army remained my career. She became my reason. As I advanced through the ranks, promotions brought larger responsibilities. Eventually, I pinned on Colonel. It was one of the proudest moments of my life. Daniel stood beside me in dress uniform. Emma, only 6 years old, saluted me with complete seriousness before bursting into giggles. That photograph stayed on my bedroom dresser until the day Daniel died. After his funeral, I packed it away. Not because I stopped loving those memories. Because every time I looked at them, I remembered what we'd lost. Retirement wasn't really retirement. It was escape. I accepted consulting work with a nonprofit helping veterans navigate legal issues, benefits, appeals, housing disputes, employment rights. Nobody cared about my rank there. I preferred it that way. When people asked what I'd done before, I'd simply say, I practiced military law. Technically true. Comfortably incomplete. Back inside the courtroom, Patricia's attorney began presenting his opening argument. He described me as isolated, secretive, emotionally distant. He emphasized my military background as though it somehow explained every accusation. I listened without reacting. Then he said something that genuinely surprised me. Mrs. Bennett has struggled to maintain healthy relationships because of experiences she refuses to discuss. Interesting. He was trying to turn my privacy into evidence. That wasn't unexpected. What surprised me was realizing Patricia had probably believed every word. She'd mistaken silence for instability. Maybe because she'd never encountered someone who simply didn't feel the need to explain themselves. The judge turned toward me. Mrs. Bennett, I stood. My response will come through evidence rather than speeches, Your Honor. He nodded. Very well. As I sat back down, the courtroom clerk approached with a stack of exhibits. She placed them carefully on my table. Then, without thinking, she smiled. Everything's organized exactly the way you always liked it, Colonel. The word echoed louder this time. Colonel. Patricia slowly turned toward me. For the first time since this hearing began, I saw uncertainty replace confidence, not fear. Not yet. But the certainty she'd carried into this courtroom was beginning to crack, and she still had no idea how much she didn't know. By the time the lunch recess ended, the atmosphere inside courtroom 3B had changed. When I'd walked in that morning, most people had looked at me with polite curiosity. Now they kept stealing glances. Not because I had suddenly become important. Because people hate unanswered questions. Who was I? Why did the judge know me? Why had the courtroom staff called me Colonel as naturally as saying Mrs. Bennett? Patricia was wondering the same thing. I could see it every time she looked across the room. Her confidence hadn't disappeared. It had become cautious. And cautious people make mistakes. Judge Whitmore returned to the bench promptly at 1 o'clock. Let's continue. Patricia's attorney, Charles Donovan, stood. He had an excellent reputation throughout Central Virginia. I'd read enough of his filings over the previous month to know he prepared thoroughly. He wasn't arrogant. That made him far more dangerous. He called Patricia as his first witness. She walked confidently to the stand Bible in hand, took the oath, and settled into the witness chair. Mr. Donovan smiled warmly. Mrs. Bennet, why are you asking this court for custody of your granddaughter? Patricia looked toward Emma for just a second before turning back. Because I love her. No objection. Love wasn't in dispute. And why do you believe Laura Bennet is unable to provide the stability Emma needs? Patricia sighed. Ever since my son's death, she's become withdrawn. She dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. She isolates Emma. Can you explain? She rarely brings Emma to family gatherings anymore. I wrote one note. Rarely. Not never. Words matter, Patricia continued. She keeps secrets. Mr. Donovan nodded sympathetically. What kind of secrets? I honestly don't know. A few people chuckled softly. Even Patricia seemed to realize how odd that sounded. She hurried to explain. I mean, she never tells anyone anything. What do you mean? I don't know where she goes. I don't know who she talks to. I don't know what she really did in the army. She looked toward me. For years, I believed she was an administrative officer. Another pause. Apparently, I was wrong, Mr. Donovan continued carefully. Did Laura ever intentionally mislead your family? I believe she did. How? By pretending to be ordinary. The sentence hung awkwardly in the air. Judge Whitmore looked over his glasses. Mr. Donovan wisely changed direction. Has Emma ever expressed fear around her mother? No. That answer surprised me, because it was honest. Has Laura ever struck Emma? No. Neglected her? No. Failed to provide food, housing, education, or medical care? No. I noticed several jurors, then caught myself. No jury. Family court habits die hard. Instead, I watched the spectators. Several exchanged puzzled looks. Mr. Donovan quickly shifted again. So your concern isn't abuse? No. Then what is it? Patricia answered quietly. She isn't emotionally available. There it was. The real accusation. Not something measurable. A feeling. Mr. Donovan finished his direct examination. Your witness. He sat down. The courtroom became very still. Cross-examination. My turn. I walked toward the witness stand carrying only a yellow legal pad. No dramatic pause. No performance. Just another conversation. I stopped several feet from Patricia. Good afternoon. She looked uncomfortable. Hello. I only have a few questions. She nodded. You testified we've grown distant. Yes. How many times have you asked to visit Emma during the past 12 months? She frowned. I don't remember. I do. I opened my notebook. 23. She looked surprised. You declined 17 invitations. Mr. Donovan stood. Objection. Counsel is testifying. Without looking away from Patricia, I answered calmly. I'll gladly provide the supporting emails. Judge Whitmore nodded. Overruled. I handed copies to the bailiff. Patricia stared at the papers. You were invited for Thanksgiving. Silence. For Emma's school concert? Silence. For her birthday? Silence. Correct. Yes. You chose not to attend. I was busy. You were on a cruise. She looked down. Yes. No further explanation needed. A few quiet laughs came from the gallery. Not mocking. Just human. I continued. You also testified that I isolate Emma. Yes. Does Emma participate in soccer? Yes. Church youth choir? Yes. Summer science camp? Yes. Sleepovers? Yes. So she's socially active? Yes. Honor roll student? Yes. Receives regular counseling after losing her father? Yes. Counseling that you personally recommended? Patricia hesitated. Yes. I smiled gently. Thank you. She shifted nervously. The confidence she'd shown earlier was fading. I wasn't trying to embarrass her. I simply wanted facts to replace assumptions. Then I asked the question I'd been saving. Mrs. Bennet? Yes. When Daniel was alive? Yes. How many times did you ask him what I actually did in the army? She blinked. One time. Silence. 5. Nothing. Ever. Finally. No. You assumed. I suppose. You never asked me either. No. So if you misunderstood my career, I let the sentence finish itself. That wasn't because I lied. She swallowed. No. Thank you. I returned to counsel table. No dramatic flourish. No raised voice. Just truth. Mr. Donovan stood for redirect examination but paused. He looked down at his notes, then back at me. For the first time all day, he seemed uncertain. He asked Patricia only 3 brief questions before excusing her. That was unusual. Very unusual. The next witness was a neighbor named Carol Simmons. She'd lived across the street from Emma and me for 6 years. I genuinely liked Carol, which made seeing her on the witness list painful. Mr. Donovan questioned her. "Mrs. Simmons, have you observed Laura Bennett keeping to herself?" Carol nodded. "She is private." "And does she socialize often?" "Not much." He smiled. "Thank you." Cross-examination. I approached slowly. "Carol." She smiled nervously. "Hi, Laura. We've borrowed sugar from each other before, haven't we?" She laughed. "More than once." "You've watched Max when Emma and I traveled?" "Yes." "I've watched your grandchildren." "You have." I nodded. "When my water heater burst?" "You helped me clean the basement." "You brought over your shop vacuum." "Yes." "When your husband had knee replacement surgery?" "You drove him to physical therapy." Carol smiled. "I did." I folded my hands. "So when you described me as private..." "Yes? You didn't mean unfriendly." "No. You meant..." She smiled warmly. "You don't gossip." The courtroom laughed. Even Judge Whitmore smiled. Carol continued before anyone asked another question. "Laura doesn't talk much about herself, but she shows up whenever someone needs help." Mr. Donovan closed his eyes for half a second. He hadn't expected that answer. Neither had Patricia. Late that afternoon, Mr. Donovan stood once more. "Your Honor, the petitioner calls Stephen Bennett, Daniel's older brother." Stephen walked confidently toward the witness stand. Unlike Patricia, he looked almost pleased. That bothered me. Because Stephen had always been smarter than he let people believe. If he was smiling now, he thought he knew something I didn't. And after 20 years as a prosecutor, I'd learned to trust that feeling. Stephen Bennett had always been the polished one. Perfect haircut, tailored navy suit, expensive watch. The kind of man who never seemed to sweat even during Virginia summers. He shook the bailiff's hand before taking the oath, smiled politely at Judge Whitmore, and settled into the witness chair as though he'd rehearsed every movement. In a way, I was sure he had. Daniel used to joke that Stephen never entered a conversation without an exit strategy. It wasn't really a joke. Mr. Donovan approached the witness stand. "Mr. Bennett, how would you describe Laura's relationship with your family after your brother passed away?" Stephen sighed. "It changed." "In what way?" She slowly pushed us away. He looked toward me with what appeared to be genuine disappointment. "At first, we all leaned on each other. Then she stopped returning calls. She became guarded." Mr. Donovan nodded. "Did that concern you?" "It did." "Why?" "Emma lost her father. I didn't want her losing her grandparents, too." That was a good answer. Reasonable. Measured. Exactly the kind of testimony judges hear every day. Then Mr. Donovan introduced a stack of printed text messages. "I'd like to enter Petitioner's Exhibit 12. The pages were handed to the judge, then to me. I recognized them immediately. Messages between Stephen and me from nearly 18 months earlier. Except, something felt wrong. I scanned the first page, then the second. My stomach tightened. Several messages were missing. Not altered. Removed. The conversation had been edited. Mr. Donovan continued. "These messages demonstrate Mrs. Bennett repeatedly refusing family contact." Judge Whitmore looked toward me. "Any objection?" "Not to authenticity, Your Honor." He raised an eyebrow. "But to completeness." "Explain." "The conversation has been selectively printed." Mr. Donovan frowned. "They're accurate." I didn't say they weren't. I stood. "They're incomplete." Judge Whitmore folded his hands. "Do you have the full exchange?" "I do." I reached into my leather folder and removed another packet. I anticipated this. The bailiff distributed my copies. The judge quietly compared both versions. His eyebrows lifted. Several additional pages appeared in mine. Messages Patricia's attorney hadn't included. One read, "Stephen, Mom's upset. Give her a little time." My response, "Laura. Of course. Tell her she's welcome for dinner next Sunday. Emma misses everyone." Another, "Stephen, sorry, we're going to Myrtle Beach that weekend. Maybe next month." Another, "Laura, Emma's school play is Friday. We'd love to have you there." No response. The silence inside the courtroom became uncomfortable. Judge Whitmore looked toward Mr. Donovan. "Counsel." Mr. Donovan quickly stood. "Your Honor, I was provided only the documents my clients supplied." "I understand." The judge's voice remained calm. "But the court prefers complete conversations." "So do I." Mr. Donovan nodded once. "So noted." I glanced toward Stephen. For the first time that day, he looked nervous. Cross-examination began. I walked toward him. "Good afternoon, Stephen." He forced a smile. "Laura, we've known each other almost 16 years. "That's right. You've always considered yourself honest." "I try to be." "I believe you." That surprised him. It also relaxed him. People answer differently when they don't expect an attack. I have just a few questions. He nodded. You testified I stopped communicating. Yes. Did I invite your family to Emma's 10th birthday? Yes. Her 5th grade graduation? Yes. Christmas dinner? Yes. You declined. We had other plans. Every time? He hesitated. Mostly. I looked down at my notes. Do you remember calling me last October? I do. You asked whether Emma could stay with you for a weekend. Yes. And what did I say? He looked uncomfortable. You agreed. Without hesitation? Yes. So I trusted you with my daughter? Yes. You trusted me enough to let her come? Yes. Does that sound like someone trying to destroy family relationships? He didn't answer. Judge Whitmore looked over. You may answer. No. Thank you. I paused, then asked quietly. Stephen, who suggested filing this lawsuit. His eyes shifted. My mother. Did you think it was a good idea? Long silence. Finally. No. The words barely rose above a whisper. Patricia stared at him. What? He looked toward her. I told you we shouldn't do this. The courtroom became very still. You said Laura would never fight back. Patricia's face drained of color. Stephen continued before anyone could stop him. You said she'd settle. I thought you were wrong, Patricia whispered sharply. Stephen, but it was too late. The hearing recessed for 15 minutes. I stepped outside into the hallway needing fresh air. The courthouse windows overlooked Capitol Square. State employees crossed the sidewalks carrying takeout lunches. A city bus rumbled past. Life continued. Mine felt suspended. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. For just a moment. I wasn't in Richmond anymore. I was back overseas. Different courtroom. Different witnesses. Different families waiting for answers. I remembered the faces of mothers who would never see their sons again. Young soldiers who testified through tears. Children caught in places they never should have been. Those memories never truly disappear. You simply learn where to keep them. A familiar voice interrupted my thoughts. Colonel, I opened my eyes. Standing in front of me was Michael Torres. Older now. More gray hair. Still standing perfectly straight. I smiled despite myself. Mike, he laughed. It's been too long. It has. Michael and I had worked together for nearly 8 years. He'd been a senior Army criminal investigator. We'd interviewed hundreds of witnesses together. He glanced toward the courtroom. I heard your name was on today's docket. You came. I was already in Richmond. He smiled. Thought you might appreciate seeing a familiar face. Before I could answer, the bailiff stepped into the hallway. Mrs. Bennett. Yes. The judge has approved your witness request. Michael looked at me. You finally decided. I nodded. I didn't want to. But I have to. Back inside the courtroom, I called my first witness. Michael Torres. He took the oath. Mr. Donovan watched carefully. So, Mr. Torres, I began. How do we know each other? We worked together. For how long? Almost 8 years. What was my role? You were lead prosecutor. What kinds of cases? He took a slow breath. The hardest ones. Can you be more specific? War crimes. Corruption. Abuse investigations. The courtroom was silent. Patricia looked completely confused. I continued. Did you ever observe me ignoring evidence to protect someone's reputation? No. Did I ever decline a case because the accused held a high rank? He almost laughed. No. In fact, he looked directly at the judge. She prosecuted a 2-star general. The room froze. Mr. Donovan stood. Objection, relevance. I answered calmly. It goes directly to my character for honesty and integrity, which the petition challenges. Judge Whitmore nodded. Overruled. Michael continued. Laura lost promotions because she refused political pressure. She did what was right, even when it hurt her career. I hadn't expected those words. In truth, they hurt more than they helped. Because they reminded me of choices I'd spent years trying not to revisit. The victories. The sacrifices. The friends I'd buried. I suddenly felt exhausted. For the first time all day, I wondered whether reopening my past had been worth it. Then I looked toward Emma. She smiled at me. Just a small smile. Quiet. Certain. And I remembered exactly why I was here. Not to prove who I had been. To protect who she could become. The courtroom was so quiet that I could hear someone turning the pages of a legal pad 3 rows behind me. Michael Torres stepped down from the witness stand. As he walked past my table, he gave me the smallest nod. No smile. No celebration. Just quiet encouragement. That was Mike. He'd never been interested in dramatic moments. He believed the facts should carry their own weight. I appreciated that. Because after nearly 6 hours in court, I was emotionally drained. Representing yourself sounds empowering when people talk about it after the fact. Living through it is something else entirely. Every question had to be precise. Every exhibit had to be organized. Every emotion had to stay under control. There wasn't another attorney beside me to whisper advice or catch a mistake. If I stumbled, it was entirely on me. Judge Whitmore looked toward my table. "Mrs. Bennett, do you have another witness?" "I do, Your Honor." "I call Chaplain David Reynolds." A tall man in his early 60s walked to the witness stand. His silver hair was neatly combed, and he still carried himself like the Army officer he had once been. We had served together during one of the most difficult periods of my career. He took the oath and settled into the chair. I smiled. "It's good to see you again, Chaplain." "You too, Colonel." Patricia closed her eyes for a second. I had a feeling she was tired of hearing that title. "So," I began, "how do we know one another's same—" "We served together for almost 4 years." "What was your role?" "I was the senior chaplain assigned to the command." "And what was mine?" "You were the chief prosecutor." He folded his hands. "But that title doesn't tell the whole story." I hadn't asked that question. He volunteered it. Mr. Donovan stood. Objection. Judge Whitmore looked at him. "On what grounds?" The attorney hesitated. "Narrative." Judge Whitmore considered it for a moment. "I'll allow limited explanation." Chaplain Reynolds nodded. "Thank you, Your Honor." Then he looked toward the bench. "I've worked with hundreds of attorneys over the years. Some were exceptionally talented. Some weren't. But Colonel Bennett was different." He paused. "I watched her meet with families after trials. I watched her explain legal decisions to grieving parents who didn't understand military law. I watched her spend hours helping young soldiers find counseling after they testified." His voice remained calm. "People assume prosecutors enjoy winning. Laura never saw it that way. She believed justice wasn't about defeating someone. It was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves." I felt my throat tighten. I hadn't expected that. Truthfully, I wasn't sure I deserved it. The chaplain smiled gently. "One evening after a particularly difficult case, I found her sitting alone outside the chapel. I asked if she wanted to pray. She said no. A few people smiled. Then she asked if I'd sit there anyway." Soft laughter spread through the courtroom. "Sometimes," he continued, "that's who she is. Quiet. Private. But never uncaring." No further questions. As the chaplain stepped down, I noticed Emma watching him with wide eyes. Later, I realized something. She was learning things about me she'd never known before. Not because I'd hidden them from her. Because she'd been too young to understand. Now she was beginning to see the woman behind the word mom. That mattered more than anything happening in court. Mr. Donovan stood for what would become his final argument. To his credit, he didn't exaggerate. He acknowledged that I had provided a safe home. He admitted Emma loved me deeply. He conceded there was no evidence of abuse, neglect, addiction, or financial misconduct. Instead, he argued that Patricia and Richard simply believed they could offer Emma a stronger extended family environment. It was a reasonable argument, just not one supported by the facts. When it was my turn, I walked slowly to the podium. I didn't carry notes. I didn't need them. "Your Honor," I began, "I've spent most of my adult life asking courts to look past emotion and examine evidence. This case deserves the same respect." I took a slow breath. "My in-laws loved my husband. I have never questioned that. They love Emma. I don't question that either." I looked briefly toward Patricia. "They lost a son. I lost my husband. Emma lost her father. Grief doesn't belong to one side." The courtroom remained completely still. "But grief also doesn't give any of us permission to rewrite reality." I gestured toward the exhibits. "The evidence shows I encouraged contact. It shows Emma is healthy. It shows she succeeds in school. It shows she has friends. It shows she is receiving counseling. It shows she is loved." I paused. "My military career isn't why I should keep custody. It simply explains why I stayed calm when accusations were made." Another pause. "I'm not asking this court to reward me for serving. I'm asking it to let my daughter continue growing up in the stable home she's always known." I looked toward Emma one last time. "That's all." I returned to my seat. For several long minutes, Judge Whitmore reviewed his notes. No one spoke. Finally, he removed his glasses. "The court is prepared to rule." Every heartbeat seemed louder. He began carefully. "This case is not about wealth. It is not about military service. It is not about social standing. It is about the best interests of one child." He reviewed the evidence one point at a time. School records, medical records, counseling reports, witness testimony, emails, financial statements. Then he looked directly at Patricia. "The petitioner has failed to establish that Mrs. Bennett is an unfit parent." He paused. "The evidence overwhelmingly demonstrates the opposite. My fingers tightened around the edge of the table. The petition for custody is denied. I closed my eyes. Just for 1 second. Not in triumph. In relief. Judge Whitmore continued. The court also finds that several allegations presented lacked factual support and unnecessarily prolonged these proceedings. He ordered Patricia and Richard to reimburse a substantial portion of the court costs. It wasn't a punishment. It was accountability. The gavel came down. This matter is concluded. Outside the courthouse, late afternoon sunlight reflected off the windows across Broad Street. A few local reporters waited near the front steps. Apparently, someone had mentioned the unusual hearing. One reporter approached me. "Mrs. Bennett," I stopped. "May I ask one question?" "Of course." She smiled. "Why didn't you ever tell your husband's family you were a colonel?" I looked toward Emma, who was laughing, while Max, who'd been picked up from the neighbor's house, tried to chase a squirrel across the lawn. Then I answered, "Because rank isn't who you are. It's just a job you once had. What mattered most to me was being Daniel's wife. And now," I smiled, "it's being Emma's mother." The reporter thanked me and stepped aside. As we reached the parking garage, I heard someone call my name. "Laura." I turned. Patricia stood several yards away. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. For the first time in years, she wasn't trying to win. She walked over slowly. "I owe you an apology." I waited. "I spent 3 years believing things that weren't true." Tears filled her eyes. "I was angry. I needed someone to blame." She looked down. "And blaming you was easier than accepting I couldn't save my son." Neither of us spoke for several moments. Finally, I nodded. "I know." She looked surprised. "I don't hate you, Patricia. I never did." She wiped her eyes. "I don't expect forgiveness." "I know." Another long silence. Then she looked toward Emma. "May I call her sometime?" I smiled gently. "You never had to ask." Her shoulders dropped as if she'd been carrying something unbearably heavy. Maybe she had. We weren't suddenly one happy family. Real life doesn't work like that. Trust isn't rebuilt in one conversation. It returns slowly. Phone call by phone call. Birthday by birthday. Small choices repeated over time. 6 months later, Patricia attended Emma's 7th grade choir concert. She sat quietly in the second row. Afterward, she hugged Emma. Then she hugged me. It was awkward. A little stiff. And completely genuine. As for me, I continued my work helping veterans with legal problems. Some afternoons, I'd meet a young soldier who believed his life had fallen apart. I'd listen. Offer practical advice. Remind him that today's setback didn't have to define tomorrow. In many ways, I was telling myself the same thing. Looking back now, I realize revenge wasn't what satisfied me. The satisfaction came from refusing to become the person grief expected me to become. The truth didn't need anger to win. It only needed patience, preparation, and the courage to stand quietly until it was heard. If this story stayed with you, I hope it reminds you that dignity often speaks louder than pride. Thank you for spending this time with me, and if you'd like to hear another true-to-life story about resilience, I'd be grateful to have you back.